The long-buried secrets of Jeffrey Epstein's network are finally being pulled from the shadows. Attorney General Pam Bondi has declared war on the forces that have kept these documents hidden for years. But as the files begin to surface, the truth is more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Lies, cover-ups, and powerful figures desperate to keep their names out of the headlines. This is the story of the most dangerous files in modern history. Underscore 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 underscore. The vault opens. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick with anticipation. It wasn't the usual hum of politics, not the background noise of shifting alliances and power plays. This was something else. Something bigger. Something that had been waiting in the shadows for far too long. The Epstein Files. The words alone had become a whispered legend in the halls of power, a ticking time bomb that everyone knew existed but no one wanted to acknowledge. It was the kind of thing that made even the most seasoned politician sweat, the kind of truth that could shatter empires. And now, after years of speculation, lawsuits, and desperate attempts at suppression, Attorney General Pam Bondi had done the unthinkable. She had ordered the release. The announcement came in a brief but electrifying press conference. Standing at a stark podium, Bondi's face was unreadable, her voice steady but carrying the weight of something enormous. She called it Phase 1 of a declassification effort that would unveil the names, the connections, and the transactions buried in thousands of pages of sealed records. The reactions were immediate and seismic. Some cheered, calling it a victory for transparency and justice. Others recoiled, knowing that if those files were as damning as rumored, careers, legacies, and possibly even lives would be destroyed. The FBI had fought to keep these records buried. Their official line was that the investigation was ongoing, that premature exposure could compromise national security. But Bondi had brushed past their stonewalling. She had seen enough. She had reason to believe that this was not about security, this was about protection. And not the kind meant for the American people. She had demanded the full release of all Epstein-related documents. What she received was a fraction of the truth, thousands of pages missing, key names redacted, timelines altered in ways that didn't add up. It was a cover-up within a cover-up, a desperate attempt to control the damage before it spiraled beyond anyone's reach. But she wasn't backing down. The moment the files were posted online, a digital feeding frenzy erupted. Journalists, amateur sleuths, and legal experts combed through the documents, searching for the golden thread that would unravel the mystery. What they found was enough to send shockwaves through the system. The first name was predictable. Epstein's closest confidant, Ghislaine Maxwell, appeared in hundreds of entries, her role more central than even the previous court cases had suggested. But there were others, figures whose names had been whispered in conspiracy circles but never confirmed. High-ranking officials. Billionaires. Celebrities whose polished images masked something rotten beneath the surface. And then, there were the omissions. Key individuals, long suspected of ties to Epstein's operation, were nowhere to be found in the first batch of documents. Their absence wasn't proof of innocence, it was proof of influence. Proof that somewhere, someone was still pulling the strings. But even as Bondi prepared for the next phase, strange things began to happen. Files disappeared from the servers within hours of their release. News outlets that had been covering the story intensely suddenly pivoted, burying the story under other headlines. A handful of journalists working on the case reported being followed, their sources intimidated into silence. And then, there was the binder. It arrived at a journalist's doorstep with no return address, wrapped in unmarked brown paper. Inside was something no one had expected, records that hadn't been part of the official release. Documents that suggested deeper government involvement than anyone had dared to say out loud. There were flight logs, emails, transaction records. The kind of evidence that could collapse an entire structure of power if placed in the right hands. Bondi had known there would be pushback. But she hadn't expected it to be this immediate. In the following days, she found herself in closed-door meetings, facing pressure from all sides. Some pleaded with her to slow down, warning that her political career, and possibly her safety, was at risk. Others, however, were less subtle. Threats became a daily occurrence, vague but chilling. And then, the leak started. Not of the Epstein Files, but of Bondi herself. Reports surfaced about her past dealings, her finances, her personal life, none of them damning enough to take her down, but all designed to make her look compromised. To cast doubt on her motivations. To turn public opinion against her before she could push further. It was a classic play, a warning wrapped in scandal. But she had seen this kind of tactic before. And she wasn't about to be bullied into silence. The real question now wasn't whether the files would keep coming. It was whether the public was ready for what came next. Because if Phase 1 had sent shockwaves, Phase 2 was going to be something else entirely. Washington, D.C. was a city built on power, and power was built on secrets. But what happened when those secrets started to spill? Pam Bondi was about to find out. The fallout from Phase 1 of the Epstein Files release was immediate and chaotic. It was supposed to be the beginning of transparency, a step toward justice. Instead, it felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The first wave of media frenzy had been predictable, talking heads on every major network dissecting the names, debating the implications, theorizing what it all meant. But then, something shifted. Coverage began to disappear. Networks that had devoted entire segments to the files suddenly had breaking news that conveniently pushed Epstein-related headlines off the front page. Celebrities and politicians who had been on the defensive just days ago were now quietly regaining control of the narrative. The discussion was being drowned out by the relentless churn of the news cycle. That's when Bondi knew. Phase 1 hadn't been enough. The real power players were still out there, still pulling the strings, still deciding what the public was allowed to know. And that's when the death started. The first was a journalist, a young investigative reporter in Miami who had been following the Epstein case for years. His body was found in his apartment, the official cause listed as an accidental overdose. Those who knew him, knew better. He had no history of drug use, no erratic behavior, no reason to suddenly self-destruct. Then, a former Epstein associate, one of the few who had been willing to testify about the inner workings of the operation. He had spoken on record about the network, the recruitment, the money trails that led to places no one wanted to acknowledge. His car was found at the bottom of a ravine in what authorities called a tragic accident. 2 deaths in less than a week. Coincidence? No one was saying it out loud, but everyone was thinking the same thing. Someone was cleaning up. Pam Bondi wasn't naive. She knew that exposing these files meant stepping into the crosshairs. The difference was, she didn't intend to back down. She called an emergency meeting with her closest legal advisors, the ones she knew she could trust. If they were going to push forward, they had to be smarter. The missing documents were the key. The FBI had already been caught red-handed withholding files. But what else had they buried? What hadn't made it into Phase 1? That's when she made the decision. She would go after the files directly. Bondi put in a formal request to access all Epstein-related records still in the possession of federal agencies. She wanted unredacted names. Full transcripts. She wanted everything they had refused to give her. And that's when the resistance became overt. The DOJ sent back a response stating that her request was under review, and that certain documents were classified due to national security concerns. It was a thinly veiled attempt to stall, to force her into a bureaucratic maze where nothing ever truly saw the light of day. That same night, Bondi's security detail reported a breach. Someone had attempted to access her personal files. Her email logs. Her phone records. Not just anyone. Federal agents. She was being watched. But they had made a mistake. Bondi had already anticipated this. She had taken precautions. The original Epstein files, the ones she had ordered for release, were only a fraction of what she had in her possession. Hidden away, encrypted, stored in places no one would think to look, were documents that had never seen the light of day. Flight manifests that were scrubbed from official records. Financial transactions routed through offshore accounts. Private correspondence between Epstein and some of the most powerful figures in the world. And among them, something even more damning. A ledger. A record of payments. Transactions made to individuals who had helped facilitate Epstein's empire. Payments to law enforcement officials, government agents, and insiders who had ensured his protection for years. If this information ever went public, it wouldn't just bring down a handful of billionaires. It would burn the entire system to the ground. Bondi knew she was running out of time. She had already drawn too much attention. And now, someone was coming for her. The night before the next phase of the release, Bondi sat alone in her office, staring at the encrypted files on her laptop. She had made a promise, to the victims, to the families who had been denied justice, to the American people who deserved the truth. But promises could get people killed. She checked the locks on her door twice. Then her phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. Do not release Phase 2. You've been warned. She exhaled slowly. The battle had only just begun. And the next move was hers. Pam Bondi stared at the message on her phone screen. Do not release Phase 2. You've been warned. It was short. Precise. The kind of message that didn't need elaboration. It carried the weight of certainty, the unmistakable feeling of a direct threat. She put the phone down carefully, her fingers still wrapped tightly around the device as she let the reality settle in. They were watching. She had known this would happen. Anyone who had dared to dig too deep into the Epstein network had found themselves at the center of something far bigger than themselves. And most had been silenced, some through fear, others through force. But she was past the point of turning back. Across her desk, the encrypted files glowed faintly on the screen. The ledger. The missing transactions. The pieces of a puzzle that had been deliberately scattered, hidden away in the hope that no one would ever put them back together. If Phase 1 had sent a ripple through Washington, Phase 2 was going to send a shockwave. She wasn't just exposing names anymore. She was about to expose an entire infrastructure of corruption. But first, she needed to move. She called her chief security officer. His voice was steady but tense. He had been tracking anomalies for the past few weeks, unmarked vehicles parked near her residence, unknown IP addresses attempting to breach her encrypted communications. The signs had been subtle at first, but now they were unmistakable. They weren't just watching. They were waiting. The next morning, Bondi was scheduled to appear at a private briefing with key members of the DOJ. It was supposed to be a discussion about the integrity of the Epstein investigation, a chance to clarify what had been released and what was still being withheld. She knew better. It was a trap. She had been in Washington long enough to recognize a staged intervention. They would pressure her, discredit her, subtly remind her of the dangers of pushing too far. And if she refused to play along, they would find another way to stop her. But Bondi wasn't walking in empty-handed. Before leaving her office, she made a decision that could not be undone. She initiated an automatic data transfer. Phase 2 of the Epstein files, every unredacted name, every flight log, every transaction, was uploaded to an offshore cloud server with a single command. The files were locked, encrypted under multiple layers of security, with one fail-safe mechanism. If anything happened to her, if she was detained, removed from office, or worse, the files would be released to the public automatically. It was her insurance policy. By the time she arrived at the DOJ headquarters, the weight of her decision was already settling in. She stepped into the meeting room, the air thick with unspoken tensions. The officials seated around the table barely bothered to hide their hostility. This wasn't a discussion. It was an ultimatum. One of them, a high-ranking intelligence officer, spoke first. His voice was slow, deliberate. The DOJ had concerns. The release of classified files posed a potential risk to national security. The public did not need to see certain names. There were protocols in place for a reason. Bondi listened, silent, unmoving. Then, another voice. One of the senior FBI agents overseeing the Epstein case. Her actions were reckless. She was playing a dangerous game. There were forces at play that she didn't fully understand. It was time to reconsider her approach. She said nothing. Because she knew what they were really saying. This wasn't about security. It was about control. The meeting ended without resolution. Bondi left the room with the same determination she had walked in with. But she knew that the real fight was just beginning. That night, she decided to relocate. Her security team had identified too many vulnerabilities, too many weak spots in her usual patterns. She had always been careful, but now, she was a target. As she packed a small travel bag, a notification appeared on her laptop. Unauthorized login attempt detected. She froze. The screen flickered, and then, without warning, her entire system shut down. Someone was inside. Not just watching. Not just waiting. They were taking action. She grabbed her phone, dialing her security chief. His voice was sharp, urgent. They had detected an intrusion. Not just on her personal devices, but on multiple government systems connected to the Epstein case. Files were being wiped. Evidence erased. It was a coordinated operation. Bondi clenched her jaw. This was it. They were making their move. And she had no choice but to make hers. She grabbed the final hard drive, her last physical copy of the most damning documents, and walked toward the door. Outside, the night air was heavy, the streets unnervingly quiet. Then, she saw it. The black SUV idling at the end of the street. She turned, slipping into the back entrance of the building, her mind racing. She needed to get out. She needed to get somewhere safe. And she needed to release Phase 2, before it was too late. The air outside was cold, crisp, and carried the undeniable weight of danger. Pam Bondi's heart pounded in her chest as she stood at the back entrance of her building, gripping the hard drive like it was her last lifeline. Because, in truth, it was. The black SUV at the end of the street hadn't moved. Its tinted windows reflected the dim streetlights, an unspoken warning that she was being watched. Not just watched. Hunted. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. This was what they did. They didn't need brute force, not at first. They let fear do the work, let paranoia build until the target made a mistake. They applied pressure, nudged their prey into a corner, and waited for panic to do the rest. But she wasn't going to panic. She already had an escape plan. She moved fast, stepping out into the alleyway rather than the main road. Her car was compromised, she knew that before she even checked. The SUV wasn't the only one. There were others, likely stationed nearby, waiting to tail her the second she made a move. So, she wouldn't drive. She had arranged for a separate vehicle, a plain, unmarked sedan parked 2 blocks away, registered under a false name. A precaution she had put in place weeks ago, knowing this moment would come. She moved through the alley, past dumpsters and rusting fire escapes, keeping to the shadows. Every step was calculated, every movement controlled. The hard drive in her bag held the final pieces of the puzzle. The transactions, the unredacted names, the direct links between Epstein's operation and some of the most powerful institutions in the country. The missing pages from the first release. The ones someone was willing to kill to keep buried. She turned the corner and spotted the sedan up ahead, right where it should be. A wave of relief threatened to wash over her, but she swallowed it back. She wasn't safe yet. She reached for the door handle. And then, headlights flared to life behind her. A second SUV. No time to think. No time to hesitate. She ripped the car door open, threw herself into the driver's seat, and slammed the engine to life. The SUV lunged forward, tires screeching against the pavement. They weren't trying to be subtle anymore. She sped down the empty street, the engine roaring as she pushed the sedan to its limits. The SUV was right behind her, staying just close enough to keep pressure on her. It was a tactic. They didn't want to run her off the road, not yet. They wanted her to make a mistake. Wanted her to lead them to where she was going. She gritted her teeth. They weren't getting that chance. She veered suddenly onto a side street, cutting through an industrial area where the roads were rougher, darker. The SUV followed, but she had the advantage. She knew these roads. She had scouted them for this exact scenario. Another sharp turn, then another. The chase twisted through the city, weaving between empty warehouses and closed-down factories. She could feel the adrenaline pulsing through her veins, the absolute clarity that came with survival instinct. She had minutes. Maybe less. The hard drive had to be secured. If they caught her now, it wouldn't just be about stopping Phase 2. It would be about making sure Phase 2 never existed. She made a final turn, heading toward an underground parking structure she had scoped out earlier. A perfect place to disappear. The SUV followed, exactly as she had planned. As soon as she hit the lower level, she killed the headlights, skidding into a shadowed corner between two abandoned cars. The SUV roared in behind her, its own headlights slicing through the darkness. But she was already moving. She grabbed the hard drive, yanked open the door, and bolted toward the side exit. She didn't need to outrun them for long, just long enough. The exit led to a stairwell, and beyond that, a secondary alley. She sprinted, heart hammering, as the first car door slammed open behind her. Voices. Heavy footsteps. They were coming. But they weren't fast enough. She burst out into the alley, her escape route waiting for her, an unregistered motorcycle stashed behind a dumpster. Another precaution. She jumped onto the bike, kicked it into gear, and peeled away into the night, leaving the shouts and scrambling figures behind. She had won this round. But she knew the game wasn't over. She drove until she was sure she wasn't being followed. Not home. Not to a safe house. Instead, to the one place they wouldn't expect. A nondescript office building, closed for the night, no security cameras, no electronic records of her presence. Inside, waiting for her, was the final failsafe. A dead-drop server. She plugged in the hard drive, transferred the files, and set them for release. Not immediately. She needed time. But the countdown had begun. Phase 2 was coming. And this time, no one could stop it. The night air was still, but Pam Bondi knew better than to mistake silence for safety. The files were uploaded. The countdown had started. In exactly 6 hours, Phase 2 of the Epstein Files would go live across multiple independent news sites, encrypted networks, and anonymous forums. Every attempt to stop the first release had failed, but this time, there would be no stopping it. This was the detonation. The system that had spent decades protecting the powerful, erasing names, and burying victims beneath bureaucracy and blackmail was about to be set on fire. She knew what that meant. They would come for her now. No more warnings. No more veiled threats. They would move to erase her, just like they had erased the others before her. She wasn't going to let that happen. She stepped outside the office building, slipping through the back exit, her eyes scanning the darkness for movement. Her burner phone buzzed. A message. "You've left us no choice." They knew where she was. The response was immediate, headlights flaring to life in the parking lot, the unmistakable hum of an idling SUV. Bondi didn't run. She had planned for this. Instead, she walked forward, her hands loose at her sides. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing fear. The SUV doors opened. 4 men stepped out, dressed in black. No badges. No insignias. Not government. Private. Hired. The kind of men who didn't leave witnesses. One of them pulled a suppressed handgun, leveling it at her. But before he could take a step forward. Boom. A sudden explosion rocked the parking lot, shaking the ground beneath them. Not an attack. A distraction. From the darkness, a separate car tore into view, headlights blinding, tires screeching. Bondi moved. The split-second hesitation from the gunman was all she needed. She sprinted for the car as it skidded to a stop, the door flying open. She dove inside. The driver hit the gas before she could even shut the door. The SUV men recovered, gunfire erupting behind them, but they were already gone, lost in the maze of the city before the enemy could organize a chase. Bondi exhaled sharply, adrenaline still surging through her veins. The driver glanced at her. A journalist. One of the few she trusted. "You really pissed them off," he muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. She let out a small, humorless laugh. "They haven't even seen pissed off yet." 5 hours left. Bondi had one last stop before Phase 2 went live. She had to be sure. If she was going to burn down an empire, she needed the world to be watching. The journalist drove through the night, winding through back roads and side streets, making sure they weren't followed. They pulled up to a small, unassuming building on the outskirts of the city. Inside, waiting for her, were the final pieces of the puzzle. A group of whistleblowers. Victims. Insiders. People who had seen Epstein's empire from the inside and survived. They had been waiting for this moment. She sat down at the table, setting the hard drive in front of them. The silence in the room was thick, charged with unspoken horrors. Bondi looked them in the eyes. "This is it," she said. "Once these files drop, there's no going back. The world will know everything." One of the women, older now, but the scars of her past still visible in her eyes, reached forward and touched the hard drive. Her fingers trembled. Then she nodded. "Do it." Bondi pressed the final key. Phase 2 was live. The reaction was instantaneous. The servers flooded with downloads. News agencies scrambled to keep up. Social media exploded with names no one had expected. Senators. CEOs. Intelligence officials. A sitting Supreme Court justice. The redacted names from Phase 1 had been uncovered. There were video recordings, footage Epstein had collected as leverage. There were wire transfers, money moved between offshore accounts, tied directly to political campaigns and media conglomerates. There were emails, proof that law enforcement had been ordered to stand down, that prosecutors had buried cases, that presidents had been briefed on Epstein years before his first arrest. The entire machine was exposed. And there was nothing they could do to stop it. The fallout came within hours. The DOJ collapsed under scrutiny. The FBI director resigned. Multiple high-profile figures went into hiding, some vanished entirely. An emergency session of Congress was called. There were talks of indictments, arrests, treason charges. The world was watching. For the first time, there was no way to spin the story. No way to bury the truth. Pam Bondi had done what no one else could. She had set the system on fire. The next morning, Bondi sat alone in a quiet hotel room, the curtains drawn, the TV playing in the background. A breaking news alert flashed across the screen. More resignations. More trials. The world was still reeling. Her phone vibrated. A single message. From a number she didn't recognize. "You won." She stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in weeks, she let herself breathe.